Hello everybody and welcome. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the mana pool to discuss a very unique company that not only made video games, but a console of their own. Once the darling of media, now forgotten with time. I'm one of your co-hosts, Garrett.
I'm Ben.
And you're listening to
Out of Mana. 3DO. What does it mean to you? Is it just a number, 2 letters? 3D with an O? To some people, it's a gaming company that developed their favorite games from army men to battle tanks. Or you might be one of the people who know it as the developer of the long forgotten, maybe not so forgotten if you're an old fan, 3DO interactive multiplayer console. So Garrett, which one are you?
I'm going to be completely honest and say that I forgot 3DO was either one of these before we started doing this until I realized it was the company that created the Army Men games, like you said, ones that we've played together many times.
And on that note, I'm one of the people who remembers it for the games they developed.
Yeah, I didn't even know they made a console, I'll be completely honest.
There was vague recollection in the back for me, but I was just a dirty look in my dad's eye at that time, to be perfectly honest.
So what's exciting about this is that not only did I get to learn about all this, but now we get to share everything we've learned with you.
In our deep dive of the mana pool, we learned about 3DO the company, 3DO the console, and the very established people behind it.
Yeah, and someone who you may be familiar with, maybe not by name, but what they've done, was their founder, Trip Hawkins. Now, he was originally a director of strategy and marketing at Apple Computer.
Yeah, in the 1970s.
Yeah, exactly. And didn't he do that? He was part of this think group that he predicted by 1982 that most households would have computers, right?
It was a very classic fear and thought of the 1970s was, especially in the mid-70s, I think 1975 was when he came up with that idea, was where was the personal computer going to go? IBM was convinced it would only stay in business. IBM, in fact, banked their entire company on the professional computer. Only businesses would use computers. Homes would never need them. Now we know IBM as basically nothing today. Because of that, they did not bank on that. But Tripp, he said by 1982, most homes, if not all of them, would have computers in their home and have the ability to play games on them. And
he was right, because he went on to found Electronic Arts, which we all know, if you're a gamer, in 1982. He was actually credited for spearheading the change of one-person video game creations to complex group projects. And one of his big gets, actually, was getting John Madden as a spokesperson and consultant for what we all know now of Madden NFL.
That was a big deal. A lot of the upper echelon of media, otherwise known as recognizable names, stars, did not really touch onto video games especially that much. Video games were still a market that was relatively small still by the early 80s. It hadn't exploded yet. The arcades hadn't exploded yet. Home consoles were still in their infancy. And Trip Hawkins finally gave that final push by bringing it to the big names.
Yeah, and here we are in 2021, and everyone's still looking forward to the next Madden NFL game.
The next Madden, the next FIFA, the next slap a name on it. Hey, remember in the mid-2000s with the 50 Cent game?
Oh my god, Def Jam, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, so Trip Hawkins has always been an innovator in that kind of way.
He's been a mover and shaker in the market. Back in the early 80s, he was seen as the innovative young mind of the market. And in 1982, he started Electronic Arts and finally moved things into the future, finally pushed things forward, and the media loved him.
Exactly. So in 1991, he founded the company 3DO. And his goal was to create a new console that was going to push towards the future.
His goal was to start rolling forward with consoles and move them from the 2D side-scrollers into more of the computer-generated graphics of that time, which was 3D. and a big deal, and everyone was excited for it.
But he wasn't able to do this alone. He needed someone with smarts. He needed someone with the ability to create the actual hardware. And that's where his friends David Needle and RJ Michael come in.
They came rolling in from their success with the Amiga 1000 and the Atari Lynx, both of which weren't huge sellers, but gave them a lot of experience in the market of creating a console for video games.
Yeah, the Amiga 1000 was, I think that was like a computer kind of system.
That, I believe, was a full-on computer system.
And then the Atari Lynx was a handheld, if I remember correctly.
It was a kind of a weird handheld. It kind of had the Game Boy Advance style to it, where it was long and you held it kind of like a PSP as well. But it did not do very well compared to the Game Boy.
Correct. Yeah, it wasn't that successful. But yeah, so those two became the co-founders of what was called New Technologies Group, along with Dave Morse, who is the ex-president of Amiga, actually. They had worked together before.
And when it came to the 3DO console, in about 1991, all of them kind of had a powwow in a restaurant, and this console had the classic birth origin story of many great ideas, which was to be written on a table napkin and go from there.
Exactly. You're right. That's like the classic, okay, we're going to design it on the napkin, and then we create a demo, and then we go show it off to a bunch of people.
As someone who's kind of in the architectural field, that's where a lot of great ideas come from, is you write it down, you jot it down on a piece of wood, on a napkin, on a piece of paper, on whatever you've got near you, and the idea goes from there.
So that's what happened. They created the software and the hardware of what would soon become the 3DO. Like I mentioned, they created a demo where they went to go show it to a bunch of different people because they needed someone to take this bait.
And Trip Hawkins took the bait. He was very interested in their group. He had past relations with them as well.
Correct.
He knew of their work very well. And when he saw this idea come to fruition, napkin left behind, but he saw it become a real thing, he decided to go full into it head first.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the hardware of this console, because it was supposed to be the most powerful system out there.
This console was literally bringing in the new generation of video game consoles. By all means, it should still be with us today in its new generations. This console was going to change the entire market.
Yeah, the media was buzzing about it, and not only just video game, but like things like CNN, business,
Time
news.
Magazine, anywhere from magazine to news media was all over this in every way possible. This, like we said in our intro, this was the darling of media. This was basically the Shirley Temple of its time, of that brief moment in time in the early 90s.
And so here are the hardware specs that they were all surprised about, which this may make sense to some of you, but it had a 12.5 megahertz CPU, 2 megabyte RAM, 1 megabyte video RAM. It supported Dolby surround sound.
A big deal back then.
Yeah, and it went up to 640 by 480 resolution and had 2 video processors.
The real-time pixel display of this was going to blow consumers away, and they were fully prepared for it.
Yeah, they needed a console that could play like these popular arcade games like in their home, and it was able to run everything. It was basically what people wanted. People
could enjoy the semblance of an arcade game on their consoles before this, but this was going to bring in 3D graphics, which was a concept that wasn't really seen yet by this point in time. In the 90s, people were used to side-scrollers. They were used to platformers. They did not have 3D graphics on their games yet, and this was going to do it. And it was a 32-bit system, and it was CD-based as well.
It was CD-based, which was extremely unusual. The CDs were very new still. They had really only premiered in the mid-'80s for music and other types of media, but not much. And by then, they were still extremely new, and a lot of people could not even afford CD players in their homes. Mm-hmm. They still used tapes, and they still used floppy disks primarily. So, Ben, we've got the brains behind it, so Trip Hawkins, and then we've got the designers, David Needle and RJ Michael, of the 3DO Real Interactive Multiplayer FZ1. God, what a name, huh?
That name, it's exactly what people want to see when they're buying. It's the kind of name you expect the military to put on the side of a battleship or on the newest jet fighter, the kind of thing that breaks the sound barrier. But this was something people could buy and put in their homes. This was the product, the name of the future. You had the Real Interactive, all caps, and the FZ-1. That sounded cool, and that was exactly what the market wanted.
Exactly. If you looked at some of the commercials, actually, they kind of went for an edgy theme because Nintendo was always family friendly, and then Sega was kind of, teens. But they were a bit more edgy with their commercials.
3DO took those old and tried and true tropes for those other companies. They took that and ran with it. 3DO decided to do their commercials primarily focusing on, look at how cool we are and how against the grain we are and how different we are. They had commercials that compared. They used comparative commercials. They had commercials that would say, Nintendo players are passive, maybe even meek. Then you have the Sega players who are aggressive. Then you have the 3DO players who are assertive, and they're basically going to say, eat it. Eat my shorts. And that's what people wanted to see. And you had every commercial had something along those lines. It was edgy, it was spicy, and it was mean.
Yeah, I like the one where it was showing the Nintendo and Sega like literally being put into a toy box. It said toys on it.
They wanted to separate themselves from the idea that these consoles were toys. These consoles were entertainment platforms. They were meant to be experienced, not just played with.
FZ-1.
The FZ-1. This was meant to clear the world start the war and destroy everything. This was meant to be the coming of the next age.
So they had the brains, but now they needed someone to actually make this hardware because they weren't going to be doing it themselves. So Ben, who did they reach out to?
Well, it was a tough choice. There were two large creators, two large production people in the market at that time. Some of the biggest media companies at that time. They were both out of Japan. And if you had a television in the 90s, you had a stereo system, speakers, whatever you want to have it that played music, that did any kind of entertainment, it was probably made by one of these companies, Sony or Panasonic.
Exactly.
And Trip Hawkins went up to each company propositioning, saying, hey, do you want to build my future console? The next thing to take the market. Sony was interested. Sony showed interest, but they had a problem. They were still in the early development stages of their own groundbreaking console.
Exactly, yeah. And they had to choose whether or not do we just pick this up as our console, or do we go with our heart and keep following our dream?
The 3DO was a lot further along than their own console was. Mm-hmm. The console that we all now know as the PlayStation 1. They were a lot further along, the 3DO was, and Sony was very tempted to just go all in with this and show themselves up in that market. But they decided against it, and they decided to stick with their own console, which would later prove to be a very, very, very big point in 3DO's existence.
So that gave the other option, and it was Panasonic who did accept the offer.
Panasonic was a big contender in the market at that time. They weren't quite as diluted as they are now. They were a big producer for pretty much any kind of entertainment system you could have. And they went ahead and took Trip's bait and started in production.
So this is where it starts getting interesting because it may seem great right now, but later on we're going to find out how this affected the console. So we're going to be talking about the royalties here.
This was the next big step, and Tripp had a very interesting idea. Probably not a great one, but he decided to be different from the other production companies. Different from Nintendo, different from Atari, and different from
Sega as
well. And he decided to have a high production cost or a high ticket cost to the consumer.
For the console, yeah.
For the console. So basically what Nintendo would do, for instance, is they would produce their consoles and they would sell them at a loss. This is something that's still commonly practiced in the industry. Mm-hmm. They would sell them at a loss and then they would make all of that money back, hopefully, by selling their games. And this would mean that any developers of those games would have to basically take a cut to their profits from Nintendo themselves. Mm-hmm. And that is something Trip Hawkins didn't want to do. He wanted to attract more developers by having a very, very low margin of take from them by instead selling his consoles for a very, very high ticket price.
Exactly. So yeah, 3DO was getting royalties on each of the consoles sold, but the important part was that they were only doing $3 royalty on each game sold, compared to Nintendo's $15 and Sega's $13.
And those are approximates, and that is a big difference, especially back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Every dollar meant a big deal back then, as it still does now. But that attracted a significant interest in the 3DO market.
Hundreds of developers were
Developers,
like, oh, only $3?
developers flocked like him. I mean, he was covered in honey, and they wanted some of it. And he, I believe, signed into about 200 developers, maybe more than that.
I think it was like 300 were like signed on to like ready to build games for this console.
And that is what Tripp was banking on with the sale of his console. He was saying the consumer will pay a lot of money up front, but they will have a wide and cheap selection of games to choose from.
Yeah, and like we mentioned before, the media was buzzing about this. The news, the stock market, investors, magazines. Time Magazine's 1993 Product of the Year was the 3DO console.
And that was a big deal.
And I believe I also saw somewhere that Tripp Hawkins was like kind of a CES darling, and he got to do like the keynote speech there. I think there was something spicy about it, like Bill Gates wanted it.
And on that note, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Bill Gates on that year specifically requested to be that keynote speaker. Even in the 90s, Bill Gates was a big deal. You did not say no to Bill Gates. It wasn't a threat or anything, but he was a big deal. He had literally changed the world.
Mm-hmm.
To be said no to, for them to say, "Hey, Bill Gates, take a seat. Sit on the bench. Sit on the bench for this game, for this play, because we're gonna have this guy, our newest darling, come up on stage."
Oh man, and so you can imagine that this was going to be the next big thing. Like everything seemed great for this console.
The carpet was rolled out. All they had to do was strut down the aisle, and they were gonna win.
So it launched on October 1993 for a whopping $699.
And that was a whopping amount.
This is 90s dollars too.
And when that launched, unfortunately, it came to basically crickets.
Yeah, it had kind of a rough start.
It had a rough start. The 3DO had a lot of production issues close to its release, on top of the biggest issue being that they didn't have any launch titles. They had
They had one game.
single launch title, and the media was aware of this, and the consumers were aware of this. Before the console went on sale, they were aware of this, and the buzz in the last waning time before the console finally hit the floors was waning very badly.
Yeah, Jurassic Park Interactive was supposed to be the launch title, but it ended up being Crash and Burn, which is like a racing kind of game that was made by Crystal Dynamics, which some of you may be familiar with today, actually.
Some of you are hopefully familiar with that, because it was very good company, but it was not Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park was the explosive title, the explosive franchise, and it was going to be their hot seller on their console, and it was not there on the release. Many people were anticipating it, and they instead got Crash and Burn, which was actually received fairly positively. But it was the only game to choose from, and Tripp's entire marketing campaign relied heavily on the fact you pay a lot of money, but you have a big library to choose from.
On top of that, without having many games, it was hard to get a console. A lot of stores weren't getting many consoles on their shelves right away.
A lot of stores were suffering from a lack of product. They were given maybe 1 to 2 consoles, if even that. Basically, what you saw on the display floor was what they had in their inventory. And once that sold out, once someone came in and threw a bunch of money down, that was it.
And then here's the nail in the coffin. There was already talks of new consoles coming out before the 3DO actually launched by the big household names that everyone already knew. So Ben, which ones were those?
This was really the big deal. The interest was waning because of the lack of selection. And then on top of that, you had Nintendo make an announcement for Project Reality?
Yeah, Project Reality.
Project Reality, the future now. Video graphics at your face. Something along those lines. It was a big deal. This was a Nintendo announcement. Nintendo and Atari were the kings of the hill of gaming industry back then. That was a big deal. But not only Nintendo.
Yeah, you also had Atari with their Atari Jaguar, which was it was a 64-bit as well.
Purportedly, it was the 64-bit system in a time that didn't even have the 32-bit.
Yeah, and Nintendo, the Project Reality was Nintendo 64, also 64-bit.
And then to top that off, the ultimate betrayal was the PlayStation 1 from Sony. Sony finally showed their hand, and Tripp got an idea of why they said no to him.
Yeah, this hurt sales bad because people just, they saw, they see the 64-bit. This is bigger. I mean, they may not have been more powerful consoles, but they were promising something new and advanced.
From well-established companies, not young fledgling companies like the 3DO was.
And like Ben mentioned earlier, these companies knew what they're doing. They're not new to this, so they were selling consoles at a loss.
Yep.
To just get people in the door.
They were doing basically the smart thing in the industry, which was to sell it at a loss, which meant that you would make your money in the games. And then to top this off, these were companies that had established franchises. They had the meat that Tripp did not.
So let's talk a little bit about post-launch. Devs were dropping support due to the low game sales. Prices needed to drop to meet consumer expectations because, as we said earlier, everyone was selling cheaper, and 3DO was still up there with that $699. So in April 1994, Panasonic reduced it down to $499, and there was actually another version, because they were just licensing out this hardware for people to make. Panasonic wasn't actually the only ones to make their version of this 3DO.
Tripp was well aware of all these bumpy, rocky starts, and he knew the primary reason was the ticket price. That was a shock.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't want to pay that much money for a console. They didn't, and especially when it was taking him so much time to release more titles for them. So, Panasonic reduced their price. They cut it down, and he actually advertised that. He made a big deal of Panasonic's really we're selling them for cheaper now.
Mm-hmm.
It was still expensive. It was $499. That was still quite a few $100s over the other consoles.
Mm-hmm. And it was only 32-bit.
Another option came into play. And unfortunately, this trump card just didn't do it either. The Gold Star version, which was the basically dime store version of the console, still very good, very well made, rolls in at $399. So you have the Panasonic at $499 and the Gold Star at $399.
Well, you're still not selling me, Ben, because the Sega Saturn launched at $399 in 1995, and the PS1 launches at $299 in 1995 as well.
And that was it. I mean, the Sega Saturn was a good seller, but it was not even a hot seller as well. It just created more issues in the market. The PS1 was the true trump card in this scenario. They landed with a boom. The PS1 had all of the hype that Tripp wanted for his console, and it maintained it up until launch.
And then, the just desserts part here is that EA decides to back PlayStation instead of 3DO.
So as very important is that Tripp Hawkins, even when he started his company 3DO, he had basically stepped down from EA, from Electronic Arts, but he remained a member of the board of directors.
Board, yeah.
When EA did this, EA was making decisions without his knowledge. They decided to now produce games for the PlayStation, which they were previously exclusively producing games for Tripp's console. This was the nail in his coffin for Electronic Arts. This stab in the back. He had to step down from the board of directors. He basically had to have a moment where he had to decide which child to save. And he chose 3DO.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, he ended up regretting this decision down the line.
So we haven't got to the end of 3DO yet, but many years later, Tripp Hawkins would regret this decision, as Garrett said. He would say, if I could make this decision again, I would choose Electronic Arts.
He's like, I wish I would have never done 3DO. So, like you said, we're not done yet. So in December 1995, Gold Star drops down to $199, which is a $100 loss per console at this point. They're trying everything now.
They have finally reached the point where they are now doing what the other consoles are doing, too far into their product run. They are now losing $100 per console. Their game library has actually increased pretty substantially by this point. They have quite a selection of games, both made in-house and made by other developers.
And they were good games, too.
They were actually very solid games, and we can attest to this personally.
Yeah.
But too little, too late.
Yep. PS1 is just dominating 1996, and so 3DO has to make the decision to shut down its hardware department and transition exclusively into a game development company.
3DO had to basically cut their company in half. This was a big decision, and I hate to say it, the beginning of the end. The end had kind of already begun at this point, but this was the final domino in the run. They closed down their hardware development. They basically axed their console. They said, goodbye console, we can't do this anymore. Trip Hawkins decided that it just wasn't worth it anymore. But what he was making money from was selling, and he knew that he could still perhaps develop games for other companies and consoles and hopefully make it up from there.
Yeah, so there was a few things he could still do. There was actually talk of a second console, the 3DO M2, but that ended up being canceled, and 3DO actually sold this technology to Panasonic for about $100 million.
And it was never used. It was never used. 3DO actually sold a lot of their IPs, of their tech to the other companies, and nothing really came of it.
Yeah, they sold their hardware business to Samsung for $20 million.
3DO started off at the top with the newest in tech, and by the time they basically said goodbye to their console, been there, done that. People had 3D graphics. People expected 3D graphics. They definitely expected it from 3DO.
Mm-hmm.
And they got it with the PS1. They got it with a Nintendo 64. They had it. 3DO didn't really have anything new anymore. So this was the next step in their stage, was to drop the console and move on to purely development in games.
Yeah, and Panasonic ended up using that technology just to put in various other electronics that they ended up making down the line. Not video game related, they just used the technology. So yeah, the 3DO ultimately sold about 2 million units, which sounds like a lot.
It's not.
But if you think about the population of the world, and especially the United States and stuff, and Japan, where
primarily the United States, and 2 million is nothing. And throughout the life from then till now, you might have even seen a 3DO console in a thrift store or something and probably thought it was a VHS player.
It looked heavily like a VHS player.
At the time, that wasn't an issue. That was not a problem because VHS players were incredibly modern, incredibly useful, and considered beautiful, as well as any other player that resembled it. The 3DO played CDs, and CD players also looked like this. Nowadays, and as time marched on, that was not an attractive look. And you've probably passed one up not knowing what it was.
I probably have, because I've never seen one of these ever.
I'll tell you right now, you should regret that because their resale value has actually increased a little bit.
Oh, nice.
But anyway, that you might think, oh, 3DO, well, their console's gone, so that must have been the end of the company, correct? Like we've said, they moved into development purely, and that is basically the first half of their story.
Yeah, I was going to say, this the whole console portion of it is the most glorious. You know, it's all the attention.
It was very glorious. It was the darling stage.
But it was very short-lived. 3DO as a company actually existed for longer, creating tons of games. Maybe not like tons, but like quite a bit.
They had quite a few feathers in their caps by the time things closed up completely. And in this, as the 90s marched on, 3DO created some very recognizable and rather popular franchises.
Yeah, so we'll just start off with what Tripp ended up doing with that money that he got from selling the hardware. So he acquired Cyclone Studios, New World Computing, and Archetype Interactive. And he also brought on board Tony Garcia as head of development, who was previously director of development at Lucasfilm Games.
That was a big deal back then. And I said big deal a lot in this recording, but that was another big deal. That was someone who was very good at what they did and had the experience of big IPs. Yeah,
he was actually a founder of Microsoft Game Studios and was part of the DreamWorks Interactive joint venture kind of thing that they did.
Yeah.
So this seems big, right? Like 3DO brings in this head honcho, buys a bunch of studios. They're ready to get working.
We thought 3DO was down. I mean, what is this? This sounds like they were doing very good.
Yeah, and some of their biggest hits were the ones that we played, the Army Men games. They made like over a dozen of those. I think it was like 15.
They made quite a few of those, and I'm sure most of you listening are probably familiar with those. If not, they were very popular from the late 90s to the early 2000s.
I guarantee you've gone into a Blockbuster and you walked past a green face that said Sarge's Heroes 1, 2, or however many got.
And they were very popular alongside their other big one, Battle Tanks, of course.
They also got Might and Magic, which went on to be very popular.
That's a big deal. They also had Blade Force, of course.
There's like Captain Quasar, Twisted, the game show, everyone's favorite game.
Yes, and some of these are from their 3DO time period during the console period. Because they produced games, they developed games during that time period as well. But their biggest ones by far in the post-console period were the Army Men and the Battle Tanks games. Those were big deals, and people really enjoyed them. One
that was pretty popular from the 3DO console period was actually Escape from Monster Manor.
That was
very unique, interesting game.
We can personally attest to that one. It was surprisingly popular. It was a horror game in the basically ripped off style of Castle Wolfenstein.
Mm-hmm.
Completely ripped off. This is pre-Doom era. So this game was a rather surprising thing to play, and it was violent, it was scary, and it was cheesy, actually.
Very cheesy, but in an endearing
kind of way. It was rather popular, though. So this was one of the games that came out shortly after, of course, their only one title launch date. And it sold fairly well.
And, since we're talking about notable 3DO exclusives, at the time, we did talk a lot about how the console failed, but there were a lot of games on that console that did really well, not necessarily developed by 3DO specifically.
So 3DO did have their exclusives, and yes. This basically plays into the stab in the back that EA did to them.
Mm-hmm. So we got like Lucian's Quest.
We have Lucian's Quest. We have Need for Speed.
The Need for Speed.
The Need for Speed. I'm sorry, excuse me. The Need for Speed, and I think following that, Crash and Burn.
Yeah, that was the launch game. It did get the Jurassic Park interactive game eventually.
Yes. Way of the Warrior. That was another one. That was a good one.
Yeah. Let's see your Gex.
Okay, so
yes.
So the one that you might recognize, in fact, a lot of people might even know about the 3DO console because of it. Gex was first launched on a 3DO as an exclusive.
It was their best-selling game, and it sold approximately 1 million.
It sold about as many units as the console itself did, roughly.
And what's funny is I always thought Gex was a PlayStation exclusive.
Many people probably do as well.
Because what happened during that transition period, 3DO had to just all the games were being ported from 3DO on the PlayStation, all that kind of stuff.
That was where the stab in the back happened, is when the exclusives left their console and helped nail in some final nails into that coffin.
That's just so crazy to me. Yeah. That all these things I thought were from PlayStation were actually like ashes from the 3DO tragedy, really.
Basically, the 3DO's Phoenix had burned into a pile of ash, and it never rose out of it.
Yeah.
So 3DO was smoldering in this ash. Their console was gone. They had some franchises ahead of them that were going to do okay, but it was not enough. There's a reason we're talking about this as if the end is coming, and it is.
It is. So they created games for a good 7 years until they had to file for bankruptcy in May of 2003.
2003 was the end of 3DO. I did not know they died in 2003. I still played 3DO games. I enjoyed them when they were current, and I enjoyed them even for a while after that. Come 2003, they were gone. They were out. Trip finally had to accept full defeat.
Yep, and they ended up selling pretty much all their IPs to rivals like Microsoft, Namco, Ubisoft. I think that I read that Trip actually bought some of them himself. I think he kept some of them, but
he must have put them in his nightstand or something, because we haven't heard about anything.
My guess is I think they probably eventually got bought out at a certain point.
The thing is these IPs were sold, and relatively nothing was done with them.
No, nothing was done with
them.
They
were sold. They were shelved by whatever companies bought them. A lot of very recognizable companies purchased them. I don't know who purchased the Army Men title, but that was basically all 3DO had to offer were those. And once they were gone, the company just dropped off the face of the earth.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such an interesting story, because the fact that I had never known about 3DO other than just like a few games that they had made, which I barely remembered, just to think that they were once Time Magazine's product of the year. Like, it was the biggest deal of the time. and the PlayStation was just a couple years after that. And of course, I was born in 1994, so this happened before I was born.
Yep.
So the PlayStation 1 was like, the N64 and PlayStation 1 was kind of what I grew up on.
Yep, same here.
Just to know that this was just a couple years before that, and I never even knew it existed, it just goes to show how far it fell from, like, off the existence.
It is the age-old story from Hollywood to New York to Times Square to everywhere in the world where important things and important people are. They are bright lights that go out quickly sometimes. You can be Bobby Sherman on the Grammys doing big deal, and then suddenly people are even embarrassed to remember you. You can be the biggest deal in the world, and people will forget you very quickly.
Well, the good news is that there are ways to play these games. Obviously, you can go find yourself a 3DO console and hook everything up the hard way.
You can, if you want to pay some money, or you want to basically flip through VHS players at the thrift store hoping you find a 3DO console.
Or you could do the sensible thing and find an emulator online, which, like we did.
Very sensible and actually very easy. There's a very, very well-made one, a very easy-to-use one called 4DO, and that's what Garrett and I have been using.
Yeah, when we started researching this, we dove into a few of the games.
We dove into a few of the games. You know, we paddled through our mana pool, looked at these games, played them, and that's actually going to be our next topic.
Exactly. We are excited to share with you a few of the titles that we mentioned, maybe even ones that we didn't mention, in episodes to come.
In the next following episode, we are basically very excited to finish and continue this story up by telling you some of the games that this forgotten but very great company made.
Yeah, we're excited to share our thoughts and opinions of these games and also dive deeper into who made these games, the time period that it was happening, to give you a better appreciation for these games other than just the content. But
and surprisingly, some of these games were pretty innovative for their time, as well as even to look back on now.
Exactly.
They're surprisingly very innovative. Some of them even politically, in a way.
And what's cool is that you find that some of these developers on these games moved on to go make games that you loved, that you had no idea. I mean, the gaming community is actually quite small.
The gaming community, the developing community.
Yeah.
Because the gaming community is this vast network of just people who appreciate the same thing in different ways. And then you have the developers these are the artists. These are the people who create for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the special treat of this kind of research to discover names on these games that you had forgotten, if anything, and see it's someone you know and love.
Yeah, exactly. Because you said they are creators and they want to create and go on to new projects. And so you'll find that some of these developers that may have had really rocky starts went on to go on a new venture and ended up creating either a new studio themselves, created a franchise that you didn't know about, or create one that you do know about a lot.
And they were heavily involved in them or others. And we're not going to keep going. We'll digress here. We will name these people and why and how and just the wonderful bits about them as well as the games they created in our next episode.
Exactly. So we look forward to seeing you then. You can find us on social media in the links in our description. We hope you learned something about the 3DO console and the 3DO company, and we will see you next time on Out of Mana.